Good evening, and welcome to the Hollywood Babylonians. Hello, friends. This is your happy Hollywood history host with our fifth film we are covering here on the Hollywood Babylonians, your favorite classic film and Hollywood history podcast, in which we discuss the greatest films of old Hollywood and the history behind them. And today we are discussing Stanley Kubrick's 1964 black comedy, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And today, back with us, we have that fantastic actor from Atlanta, Georgia, Mr. Garrett McPherson. Garrett, how are you?
I am doing well. Enjoying the first few days of summer.
That's amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, for everybody listening, boys and girls, however you identify, this is our second time trying to record this. So that was wonderful, Garrett, how you answered that question for the second time. And for the second time, I'm going to tell you that I love your haircut. When did you get it, Garrett?
Today, an hour and a half ago.
Amazing. Fresh
very
haircut.
fresh.
And I was telling you, I love your tattoo also. When did you get that?
That I got 2 years ago in August.
Awesome.
So, I just realized when I saw you in December, I was probably wearing long sleeves because it was cold.
It was cold.
You wouldn't have seen it.
Yeah. I know. We barely see each other anymore except to record podcasts. And that's how our relationship works. So anyway, we are talking today about Dr. Strangelove, which I think is somewhat of a brilliant film. And I planned that we were going to record this episode several months in advance, and then what happened in Ukraine, which is very unfortunate. But I mean, it's very relative to what's happening over there. So I wanted to ask you first, have you seen Dr. Strangelove, and what are your thoughts on that?
I have. And I enjoyed it. It was interesting because it's a dark comedy, and it's on a lot of lists is like one of the best comedies of all time.
Right.
Like AFI's list, I think, is a big one. And I kind of walked into it expecting like just farcical. It's Peter Sellers, so like just kind of expecting over the top, I guess slapstick, and it was over the top, but it was more, honestly, it was really similar to like Catch-22. And I didn't expect that going into it. But I really enjoyed it. It's dark and kind of depressing. And like there are definitely modern day parallels that make it really prominent. And there are moments that are just so funny, like how ridiculous it is.
Yeah.
And it's funny in a frustrating way. And I guess if Stanley Kubrick was going to make a comedy, this is the comedy he'd make.
Right.
Like I guess if I think about it in that lens, it kind of changes it a bit.
Right. Well, yeah. And it is, like you said, it is a comedy. And the first time I saw it, I saw big chunks of it on TCM growing up, when I was, in elementary school and watching nothing pretty much but musicals and Hitchcock films. So I didn't understand what was going on every time I saw it. And then I saw it like several years after I got out of college. I saw it all the way through and I was like, this is actually brilliant. And it's hysterical. Everybody's hysterical. It's hilarious. And it is hilarious, I think, because it is so close to life,
Yeah.
And something that Stanley Kubrick talked about was like nuclear war is a very, very serious subject. It's, I think you call it a thanological discussion because it deals with megadeaths. But the more he started writing it, the more he was like, okay, there's some very, very comedic. I mean, it was so dark that he finally had to, filter out all of that dark stuff and deal with the content at hand by turning it into a comedy. But it's like he said, if you're in an office and you find out that, or if you're in an office and you're trying to make a movie about a nuclear blast, it's a documentary. If you're in the living room, it's a social drama. If you're in the bathroom, it's a comedy. And he kept coming back to all of these, different areas where it was just comedic, everything that was going on. And, it also pays tribute to Peter Sellers because he improvised the majority of his lines.
Yeah, I
And that,
saw that. I did some reading on it, and I saw that he improvised, which was brilliant. And also was curious, and I'm sure you'll know how that went with Kubrick. Like, you know,
right.
and I don't know Kubrick's process, but I know a lot of, there's a lot of like the high profile kind of the Mount Rushmore of directors, and they're not big fans of improvisation. Sometimes, I mean, sometimes they are, but
Right.
especially when they write, sometimes it's like, no, you're going to say what I wrote, So I'm curious as we move along, if you have anything on that whole process, because I saw
Oh,
that.
yes.
Really curious.
Yes, cool. I do. I don't want to get into it too much, but like you said, the Mount Rushmore directors like Billy Wilder and Alfred Hitchcock, everything that was on the page, what they had to say it word perfect, the actors did, because they had created a shot list, which Stanley Kubrick would never do. He would go in and it was a very organic atmosphere of creating. And
which also, I guess, comes out of that new school of directors like Martin Scorsese. And
right.
He's a little earlier, but Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola, and, they kind of changed the game. I just forget how early he is on in all of that. Like Stanley Kubrick for me feels later than he really is.
Right. Well, and I think he is later compared to a lot of the films that we talk about, because he lived until 99 and he was making movies up to that point. But this is the point, the very tail end of the studio system, which I like to talk about. And he did not like the studio system, but in order to really get credibility, he had to first go and make a giant studio epic, which was Spartacus in 1960, and then once he gained that credibility, other studios, other people were willing to give him the finances to create projects that he really, really wanted to create. He didn't like creating Spartacus just a whole lot.
Which is a great movie. Like Spartacus is great.
I think, and we could get in a whole nother discussion about this, because the book, it's called Stanley Kubrick, American Filmmaker by David Mickix, that I was listening to. It was too much. It was too modernist almost for him, because Spartacus was, the American hero, very grounded in modernism and kind of American values at that time. And Stanley Kubrick, really thought that he should break that character down and make it look as dark and depressing as it was in the days of Rome. And anyway, and Douglas wanted him, Kirk Douglas had invited Kubrick to come do Spartacus, and he had gotten Dalton Trumbo to write the screenplay, and Trumbo had been blacklisted for a long time. And this is one of his first films away from his pen name and, back into the limelight. And a lot of it was, Kubrick, especially, I think Peter Ustinov's character. The end of the film is Peter Ustinov is searching out, people that are going against the government and fueling the slave revolt and blacklisting them, and so he thought that Trumbo was taking a lot of his own life, personal experiences, filtering it through that. And, he didn't want him to break away from the script. So anyway, yes, that was that whole rant right there. But I have a few notes here leading up to, the film was supposed to come out in 1963. It did not. And there's a reason for that, but we'll get to that in just a second. Just kind of piggybacking on what you were talking about and then going into the film itself, the atomic bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, that were dropped on, Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki got Fat Man. So all of that came together because in 1938, Nazi scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered nuclear fission, which proved that an atomic bomb could be a possibility. So then Hungarian-born physicists in 1939, Leo Szilard, I think is how you pronounce it, and Eugene Wigner drafted the Einstein-Szilard letter, which warned of the potential development of extremely powerful bombs of a new type. The letter was sent to FDR and signed by Albert Einstein to encourage the USA to develop its own nuclear program, which eventually became the Manhattan Project that developed Little Boy and Fat Man. So then, of course, the Trinity Project, which was the test of the gadget, which the gadget was the same design as Little Boy that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then, as we all know, on August 6th, August 6th of 45, Hiroshima got Little Boy and Nagasaki got Fat Man, and 80,000 people were immediately killed in Hiroshima and 40,000 people were killed in Nagasaki. Well, and I was having this discussion with my dad the other night, and I was like, I don't know, from a humanitarian standpoint, that's not good.
Yeah.
But well, and so many more were wounded. Tens of thousands more were wounded. Also, the effect of the radiation, which at that point I don't think many people had talked about. And even Turgidson in the film, George C. Scott, talks about like nuclear fallout will be gone in 2 weeks, and it's like no, it won't.
No.
And I think both of those bombs were 30 megatons apiece. And so that after that, once the World War II had been won by the Allies, the Soviet Union began shaping Eastern Europe in its image. On February 9th, Joseph Stalin gave a speech in which he declared that war between the East and West was inevitable. And on February 22nd, the American ambassador to Moscow, George F. Kennan, sent the famous long telegram warning of the Soviet Union's perpetual hostility towards the West. And so then on March 5th, 46, Westminster College in Fulton, Churchill's famous words, which were an iron curtain has descended.
Yeah.
And then in 47, Truman addressed Congress with the Truman Doctrine, which was an American foreign policy that originated with the primary goal of containing Soviet geopolitical expansion during the Cold War. And then the worst happened in 49 when the Soviet Union detonated their atomic device in Kazakhstan on August 29th. The device was known as First Lightning RDS-1, aka Joe 1, and I think that was almost the exact same device that hit Nagasaki. Now somebody could write in, but that was when it was, the shit hit the fan, and they were like, oh crap. Yeah.
All of a sudden, the Americans are like, "There's another bully in the schoolyard."
Exactly. And a line you kept talking about the different worlds, like the first world, second world, third world. There was a line that was cut out of the movie that Merkin Muffley was supposed to say that the big countries act like mobsters and the little countries act like prostitutes, which is partially what fueled the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs. So anyway,
I was wrong. So I do want to clear. I was wrong in the second world. I just wanted to look it up real quick. So the second world was the socialist states that were under the influence of the Soviet Union. So Britain wouldn't be second world. Britain was first world, but like Cuba would be one that moved from the third world to the second world. Third world was we don't know. Second world is they're communists.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
I just wanted to double check because I was like, I don't think I've ever referred to Britain as a second world country except here, and I'm pretty sure I'm wrong. So
right.
Anyway.
Well, no, and that's good. Thank you for that correction. We all appreciate it. After the Soviet Union detonated their bomb, then in 1950, the top secret national security paper NSC-68 mandates massive retaliation as U.S. policy. So then I just have a bunch of notes about like 52, there was a bomb. America set off a bigger bomb, and then 53, the Soviet Union set off a bigger bomb. And then let's see what happens in 54. 54, 15 megaton American thermonuclear Castle Bravo test at Bikini Atoll, which fuels SpongeBob because Bikini Bottom is filled with radiation.
Oh, I know that one.
Oh, I do too. Yes. I was amazed my freshman year in high school. I was like, you mean these characters could actually exist? And in 1954, a nationwide Operation Alert exercises commenced, which I found this to be fascinating, where the Federal Civil Defense Administration simulate 3 nuclear bombs striking NYC. And so from 54 until protests got so big in 62 that they had to stop, they would pretend like nuclear bombs were hitting NYC, so they would practice drills with, I think, the entirety of Manhattan, where they knew where people knew what to do if a nuclear bomb should hit. And then in 1957, now this is moving into the territory of how Dr. Strangelove could have actually happened. It probably still can actually happen. But the Strategic Air Command stages a B-52 airborne alert trialed to enable nuclear-armed bombers to circle the globe on permanent rotation 24 hours a day. And I think that was because, was it the Sputnik launch? Is that how you pronounce it?
Sputnik,
yeah. And they were afraid that with the launch of Sputnik, then that would increase, the Soviets' ability to hit us with a nuclear missile.
Yeah.
So then that's when Strategic Air Command had,
that was a big concept by Werner von Braun was his idea of like orbital warfare was if they can get a space station, you can shoot a missile from space.
Exactly.
And he kind of pushed that concern.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so and then LeMay was the big proponent of the 24-hour having that able. Even when there were missiles. That was something that was interesting in the movie, was it's all about bombs.
Right.
And up until then you had missiles that could travel halfway around the globe and or a quarter of the way around the globe. But they could travel a long way and didn't need a plane. So I thought that was interesting when I watched it. I was like, this is about the bomb, not about the missiles.
Exactly. And as Herman Kahn, who wrote on thermonuclear war, loved to say, there's no such thing as war plans, but there are such thing as wargasms. So, and the bomb, as we see, is the ultimate wargasm. Slim Pickens gets to have his ultimate wargasm on that giant phallus heading down to Russia. So then, and then another thing. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but in 1957, Eisenhower permits top secret delegation of nuclear weapons use by lower echelon commanders without requiring his direct executive approval in May. And this was top secret. NASA said after this was eventually declassified that this was the darkest secret of the Cold War, and not many people knew about this. So if Eisenhower and his men were taken out, then or Kennedy and all of his men were taken out, then it was up to the military commanders whether they could use them.
Do you know when this was declassified? Did it say at all?
I think in like 93 or 94.
That's nuts, because that is literally the setup in Dr. Strangelove.
Yes.
Which he wouldn't have known, but that's the contingency that the whole film is.
Well, and there's even that disclaimer at the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
Like, this cannot happen. It's like, oh, hell yes, it can.
You could happen.
Yeah.
Dwight D. Eisenhower's probably watching and going, oh my gosh. Yes, and Kennedy too. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I guess Kennedy never mind.
Right. We'll get to that in just a second, or in a little bit, whenever that is. But then in 58, Soviet Union unilaterally announces a halt to nuclear testing in March. And in 60, Pentagon develops the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP, to launch over 3,000 nuclear warheads against the Soviets, China, and Warsaw Pact countries. And then in 60, former RAND Corporation strategist Herman Kahn publishes on thermonuclear war. We'll get to him a little bit later. Berlin crisis escalated from June to October with the border closed and the Berlin Wall construction in August. And then we've talked about the Berlin crisis. Another thing that happened, because the Soviet Union stopped nuclear testing. And then when Kennedy would not get out during the Berlin crisis, when he would not get out of Berlin, from September to October, the Soviet Union tested a new nuclear bomb every single day. And one of those was known as Tsar Bomba, which we might have actually given that nickname to it, but it was 50 megatons, which was 20 more megatons than the atomic bomb. And then they sent word to the US that was like, this can easily be upgraded to 100 megatons. We just didn't want that radiation fallout. So anyway, it was meant, he was, like you said, he was flexing his muscles. And it was kind of like, they talk about a lot in the film, and they're talking a lot about on the news now, like our nuclear deterrence, all of these things. I don't know if they ever mean, it's like their nuclear deterrence. Do they ever mean to use them, or do they just mean to deter other people from striking them? So anyway, that was one of Khrushchev's greatest deterrents, was that. So anyway, now we're getting to, in 61, we're getting to the making of Dr. Strangelove. And it said, so Kubrick really was an independent filmmaker up until the time he made Spartacus. He made Paths of Glory with United Artists, which I think at the time had been the biggest studio that he worked with, but he made like Fear and Desire, The Killer's Kiss, The Killing, and then he made Paths of Glory, with Kirk Douglas. Douglas was a big star, so then he, kind of maneuvered him into Spartacus in 1960. And it is said by 1958, Kubrick had been intrigued by the threat of nuclear war. And according to the dance choreographer on Kubrick's 55 film Killer's Kiss, David Vaughn, Kubrick had discussed fears of nuclear war attack while living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the mid-50s. The choreographer remembers Kubrick really had a paranoia about the possibility of New York being obliterated by an atomic bomb. I remember at one point he wanted to go live in Australia because it was the place least likely to be the victim of an atomic bomb attack. And in 1959, there's filmmaker Stanley Kramer. Check out his work. He has some great films. But he had made a film in Australia called On the Beach with Ava Gardner, Gregory Peck, Fred Astaire, Anthony Perkins. And it's about the nuclear war is over. The majority of the human population has been wiped off the face of the earth. And there is an extreme amount of nuclear fallout. And all of the survivors are just on Australia. And they're waiting to see if this nuclear cloud of radiation is going to kill them all off. And it turns out after sending Gregory Peck, I think, goes to see if the cloud is as bad as they say it is, and it is. So then it's just pretty much the characters waiting out till their death. He had kept that in mind about possibly making a film in Australia and possibly moving to Australia. And Kubrick had a very large library of over 50 books on nuclear war, thermonuclear war. And I mean, that was now we're concerned with not completely concerned with different things since Ukraine has happened. But at the time, so many people were terrified of the nuclear threat. Christiane, Kubrick's wife, stated that they would constantly have conversations about going to Australia in more or less the following way. Kubrick said, "The Jews always made jokes. Oh, it's not dangerous. They can't kill us. They have to learn a lesson and go to Australia." Christiane, his wife, said, "Okay, let's go." Then weeks later, Kubrick still had not bought the tickets. Kubrick would say to Christiane, "Well, they don't have a bathroom. We'd have to share a bathroom," which he did not like. Christiane would say to Kubrick, "Go, I'm all for it. I've got suitcases." Christiane said it became a very weird joke. Other people teased him and he teased himself. Kubrick, "No, I haven't done anything yet, but next week we have to do something." Then Christiane would say to Kubrick, "Well, go ahead. I can go as I am." And then Christiane said that her readiness to go drove him crazy. If his typewriter was on a different desk, he was upset. So sharing a sink with another person drove him crazy too. A little bit of Howard Hughes in there, I think. Christiane would say, "If it's not so bad, if we have to go on a ship where we have to share," well, I mean, you get the idea. It was just like over and over and over again. And he had shipped some of his funds off to Australia and put them in a bank. He was constantly going to Australia to look for filming locations. He talked to the Australian government about possibly moving there because he was so scared of the nuclear bomb. So then, because of Kubrick's paranoia with nuclear war, a friend of Kubrick's, Alistair Buchan, who worked at the Institute of Strategic Studies in London, recommended a novel by Peter George called Red Alert on October 5th, 1961. Peter George was the son of a Welsh schoolmaster and joined the RAF Royal Air Force during World War II as a volunteer, serving as a navigator on Beaufighters and Mosquitoes, which are fighter planes. Peter George saw action against the Nazis. He also served in the Korean War and resigned his commission with the RAF in 1961 to pursue writing full-time. So Peter George first contemplated the idea of the story in late 1956, around the time of the Suez fiasco, on his way back from the UK to Hong Kong. Later, while on duty with the RAF, probably in early 1957 at Peckle-Church near RAF Filton, he spotted a British V bomber flying low overhead. George casually commented to a fellow airman that it might be on its way to start World War III, which is what happened in Dr. Strangelove. But there was no World War III to be seen. There was no world to be seen after that movie. Supposing that chap went mad and suddenly flew off to drop his bombs on Russia. This aside slowly stimulated an idea about the possibility of war by accident or lunacy. In December of 1956, he met with his publisher, Tom Boardman Jr., and outlined his concept involving, in George's words, the possibility of bombers being launched by some means in which could not be recalled, and the possibility that if they reached their target and destroyed it during a time of peace, it might become necessary to accept an equivalent nuclear retaliation, as you were talking about,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mutually assured destruction.
Yes. And so the book was originally published in the UK as 2 Hours to Doom, and then published in 1958 in the USA as Red Alert. After already reading up to 50 books concerning the scholarship of the nuclear age, Kubrick then read on thermonuclear war, and he suggested it to his producer, James B. Harris. So they had read on thermonuclear war. Herman Kahn was kind of a mad genius. I think he was actually, he grew up in the Bronx like Kubrick did. And he was a Jew from the Bronx, and he was a mad scientist. And pretty much what on thermonuclear war is the entire thing is just like it's speculation over what would happen, like if we were hit by this nuclear bomb and this could kill 10 million people, how many years it would take us to recover, and if this many million people died, how many years it would take us to recover. And Herman Kahn was a strategist at Research and Development, which was RAND, the RAND Corporation, which that's pretty much all they did. Was they developed computers, they developed nuclear bombs, they developed nuclear war strategy, and they thought about, okay, so if we get hit by a nuclear bomb and many million people die, or we have this radiation fallout, how can we move on from there? It was all very, very dark discussion. And so,
well, that's kind of the way the movie ends too, is
right,
that kind of strategy of 10 females to one male, and
right,
that whole
as
bullshit.
Sellers grips his crotch off camera.
I
was watching that and I was like, gosh,
he's doing something down there. And that whole monologue was improvised as well, with his hand going all over the place, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Kubrick read this book, Red Alert, or 2 Hours to Doom. And then he went to his producer, which James B. Harris had been his producer on pretty much all of his films that he made. So what James B. Harris did is when Kubrick had an idea to make a film, then Harris would go to a studio or go to somebody with money and be like, hey, how can we get this money? How can we put this project in the studio? And so Kubrick gave the book to James B. Harris. He said, read this and then read on thermonuclear war. So then James B. Harris and Kubrick, before even contacting Peter George about this book, they started working on a script. I believe in December of 61, Kubrick wrote to George expressing interest in turning his novel into a film. George then traveled to NYC, arriving December 16th. Dates and times you really don't need to know, but by December 26th, they had worked out a deal where Kubrick and Harris had bought George's book for $3,500, the screen rights to his book. And so Peter George was formally employed by Harris Kubrick Pictures from January 7th to April 28th, 1962, but stayed on as a paid technical advisor even once filming had begun. So then pretty much what happened during that time, the beginning of 62, winter and spring of 62, while they were writing, James B. Harris had always wanted to be a director. And so during that time, amicably, Kubrick and Harris split up. And they had been working on the book Red Alert as a very serious, realistic drama and thriller. And they kept working late into the night, late hours on this. And they would become like giggly, and they'd become, they said giddy and silly. And they'd be like, okay, so what if one of them has to go to the bathroom? What if they get hungry? Who do they order food from? So all of these comic ideas kept popping up. And they would be like, okay, but seriously, this cannot be a comedy. Peter George, so after Harris left and Stanley Kubrick came to the realization that he could not do this any other way but being a comedy, because it was such dark subject matter. It was so hard for him to deal with. So, and like I said, it's a documentary in the office, it's a social drama in the living room, and it's a comedy in the bathroom. And I think because there's so many sexual implications to the film, it definitely comes off, is more of a comedy. And Herman Kahn's term wargasm also drove that to be a comedy. So then by spring of 62, Harris had left. Kubrick and George were rewriting this as a comedy. Harris had gotten a deal with Seven Arts Productions to produce Dr. Strangelove. Seven Arts had just recently, or were about to recently distribute and release Lolita in the summer of 62. Which was the film that Harris and Kubrick made prior to Strangelove that also starred Sellers. It's a whole big discussion for a different day, that movie. It kind of makes your skin crawl, but it's done incredibly well. Seven Arts was going to produce what they thought was Red Alert. I mean, they had several different titles, several different drafts. The book I read talked about nonstop. Well, it talked a lot about like the different drafts that they came up with and how hard it was to really fully flesh out an entire script without making it somewhat silly and funny. So some of the titles that they came up with were Delicate Balance of Terror, Red Alert, Edge of Doom. And finally, they got to Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. When Seven Arts found out that Kubrick had moved away from a very serious approach, they pulled out because they thought the subject matter was so dark. They don't want to produce a comedy about a nuclear bomb because that's what was terrifying the world at this point. I'm not exactly sure because the book doesn't say how he does it, how he did it, but then Kubrick got Columbia Pictures to pick up the film somewhere in between spring of 62 and the fall of 62. This is straight from the book that I read, but it says the shift embraced the paradoxical absurdities, the shift from drama to comedy, of abstractly counting megadeaths, concepts of overkill, planning for underground survival, and doomsday machines. According to Kubrick scholar Peter Kramer, Kubrick, and to some degree George, increasingly drew on the genocidal legacy of Nazism to satirize the horrendous consequences of nuclear war. For a Jewish American filmmaker of the early 60s, it would have been difficult to think about nuclear war without also thinking of the specifically Jewish Holocaust. Hence, any attempt to deal with those responsible for bringing about a nuclear holocaust evoked the Nazi past. And then elsewhere in the Kubrick archive, he has a single note card that reads Tony B, challenge and response, alluding to the British philosopher's treatise that historically civilizations collapse once their leaders no longer respond creatively to challenges, instead resorting to nationalism, xenophobia, militarism, and protecting the interests of a despotic elite. Tony B maintained that such civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. And there are also several undated handwritten notes by Kubrick concerning his philosophical approach to such subjects as comedy in the nuclear age. One item states the serious writers of the 20th century have taken themselves too seriously. The comic spirit that has been lacking, comic vision of life. Cynicism, loss of spiritual value, true world wars, the communist disillusionment, psychoanalysis has forced the 20th century writer to keep his hero uninvolved, detached, burdened with problems of relating to life. Withdrawal, asceticism, coolness, or at least madness seem the only path open. If the modern world could be summed up in a single word, it would be absurd. The only truly creative response to this is the comic vision of life. So with this, he had an undated handwritten document that outlines Kubrick's intentions for the film, which was 1, to demonstrate that a moral, technical efficiency and ruthlessness cannot prevent any accident from occurring. 2, once occurring, an accident tends to accelerate. 3, your choice at the end is the garrison state or war. 4, the absurdity of logic. 5, to satirize the government dependent on scientific advice. 6, to reveal facts about the deterrent. And 7, to be heretical. So thank you for listening to all of my copy and pasted notes on Dr. Strangelove. But I just thought all of those quotes were very interesting because that all fuels what was behind the movie and what he was trying to do with it. And I think there was a shift, honestly, in the public because this movie was so successful. This was very, very serious problem. But really, looking at it from the outside, it's like, this is ridiculous. These men were acting like idiots, which is unfortunate because a lot of them were based on real people. So by April, he was concentrating less on the conventional aspects of the script. So instead of like developing a full, completely blocked out linear script, he was looking at, the different comic ideas that he could put together or pull from to put into the script, nothing completely linear. And then George and Kubrick soaked their script in dark humor inspired by Mad Magazine and a Stanley Kubrick favorite, the realist Paul Krasner's Underground Magazine. And then in November of 1962, Kubrick brought in writer Terry Southern, who James Earl Jones said in the documentary that I watched, he was a kind of a bad, kinky boy. He had written a novel called Candy that was very sexually progressive, and he had also written a book called The Magic Christian that Peter Sellers loved to give out as like a birthday present. So he had written both of those. Terry Southern had also given Kubrick an interview, I think in 62 for Lolita, because Terry Southern wrote for Esquire. And so they knew each other somewhat. So then Terry Southern would come in and Kubrick started, every single day they drive to Shepperton Studios about 5 a.m. in the morning, and they would be rewriting the script. And Kubrick would say something like, what is the most outrageous thing that this person could say? And then Terry Southern would, chime in, and that's how they got to the bodily fluids and the purity of essence that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That whole thing, man.
Well,
and that was a real scare.
Well, it
the
was.
fluoridization of the water.
And that
it wasn't real, but it existed. People,
I know, and it was fear mongering, and it was inspired. Really, it was a real thing by the John Birch Society, so which is very, very far right wing. So those things
that still exist today.
I know
those same arguments. Look up any Alex Jones on InfoWars, and he's ranting about it's not fluoride in the water, but it's something, right? Like about losing the spirit of the American male.
Right.
It's like maybe you just have erectile dysfunction, dude.
I know. You can't. I mean, don't share your bodily fluids with anybody. And it's like General Jack D. Ripper. He says, he keeps his male essence from the females to preserve his bodily fluids, something like that, which is just ridiculous. Kubrick brought Terry Southern on in the fall of '62, and he and Kubrick worked on the Doctor Strangelove script from November through December, and then I believe early January of '63 is when they started filming. And so next, since we're still kind of talking about the development of Strangelove and its characters, there is a disclaimer that we have talked about recently called that says the characters and incidents portrayed and the names used herein are fictitious, and any similarity to the names, history, and characters of any person is entirely accidental and unintentional. The film gleans its dark humor from real events and real people, such as Rand Corporation theorist Herman Kahn. There's another disclaimer at the beginning that I believe the Air Force had put in after they saw the movie, or the Pentagon, one of the two. But for them to put this in also is completely not correct at all.
Yeah, that's what I thought when I was like, they definitely based this on people.
Right, on real people. And that's what makes it so funny. It's like, this is incredibly realistic. So it's hilarious, but it's terrifying at the same time. So the character of Dr. Strangelove was not brought about until April of '62, when Kubrick shifted to a black comedy. Scribbled on note paper, Kubrick comprised a brief character vignette of Strangelove. He said he's a crackpot realist, horny and relatively celibate, vain, ambitious, glib, persuasive, amoral, quick eyes and movements, frank, forthright attitude, speaks quickly, sexually shy, and unused to having women throw themselves at him, but quickly adapts, loves gadgets, hi-fi cameras, luxurious living. So, and he wrote several different character descriptions for each of these people. So the very first person, when the film came out, the Daily Mail stated that the real Dr. Strangelove was Herman Kahn. And Kubrick knew Kahn. He had had several meetings with him over the development of Strangelove and during the filming of Strangelove. And Kahn called Kubrick, and he badgered him for royalties for a good deal of time. And Kubrick every time was like, that's not how it works, Herman Kahn was Kubrick's favorite prophet of radioactive Armageddon, who was a theorist at the Rand Corporation. And like we've talked about, the Rand Corporation was a think tank in which scientists came together to ponder the possibility of nuclear war and its outcomes. Kahn warned that nuclear war is an immediate peril, and he added, prepare to be struck, fight back, and survive. Herman Kahn wrote on thermonuclear war, which Kubrick read at least 3 times. On thermonuclear war, well, it speculates and prophesizes the outcome of different nuclear strikes in the USA, which we talked about. And he said, if 2 million are dead, we could recuperate economically in 1 year, 10 million, 5 years, 20 million, 10 years, 80 million, 50 years, 160 million, 100 years. I mean, honestly, who wants to sit around and think about this stuff and talk about this stuff? It's just like, it's so sad. And it shows that these theorists and strategists were not concerned with one human life, one human being. Mm-hmm. They were just numbers. And to kind of disassociate from like a humanitarian policy and just think about this is kind of deeply disturbing to me. But I think that's the whole idea of Strangelove.
Well, it's like Stalin. I mean, the whole thing, like Stalin had a quote that's like, one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. Mm-hmm. And like, that's the guy that's at the beginning of this whole thing. Like, that's how he thought. And that's just nuts. Like, just absolutely wild.
I know. Well, and also it's terrifying to think that, because the political leaders then, they're not thinking about their people, the people that they are in charge of, the military and political leaders, they're not thinking about protecting their lives. They're thinking about, okay, how can we win this war statistically? According to Sharon Gamari Tabrizi, who wrote a book called The World of Herman Kahn, he was buoyant and ingratiating. He was appealingly eccentric, grossly fat, a stammerer and a wheezer, nearly narcoleptic at times, but when awake, he was insatiably chatty. Kahn majored in physics at UCLA and later was stationed as an army linesman in Burma, monitoring transmissions on the chunking wire. He was later invited by Sam Cohen, inventor of the neutron bomb, to join RAND. He later worked with Edward Teller, John von Neumann, and Albert Volstetter on thermonuclear weapons development before concentrating on military and nuclear strategy, chiefly advising the U.S. Air Force. Okay, so this is what Christiane Kubrick said about Kahn. Christiane was Stanley's wife. She said, Herman Kahn was the most terrifying person because he had abstracted all his theories, which were so mathematical and so on the button. And he had so many theories, so many numbers and scenarios to throw at you. And he would always have a whole palette of what ifs that were interwoven into this could happen that way or that way or that way. And there were always 50 varieties of how it would definitely happen. And with his very fast speech and his tremendous logic and memory for numbers, we understood everything or I should speak for myself. I could grasp onto some of his theories, maybe for about 20 seconds, and then my brain would collapse. So he was, in a sense, like Strangelove, because he would just talk on as fast as he possibly could about all of these theories. There were other nuclear theorists and strategists, such as Bernard Brodie. He was a RAND strategist who was one of the earliest intellectuals to grasp the problem of formulating a strategy for the use of atomic weapons. There was Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor, and his consecutive appointments as Secretary of State to President Nixon and Gerald Ford. Oscar Morgenstern, a consultant at RAND who wrote A Question of National Defense, suggesting the chance of thermonuclear war was greater than 50%. Most of these people that Mick Broderick talks about in his book, Reconstructing Strangelove, all were authors of books that Kubrick had in his library. So reading up on them, watching them in interviews, hearing them, all kind of informed of how he formed this character. But even forming the character in the script was not what ended up on film, because Sellers just took what Kubrick had written and then just ran off in all sorts of different directions. Other RAND strategists worth considering is Albert Volstetter, who was a mathematician, logician, and senior staff member at RAND in the 50s and 60s. Most germane to Strangelove was Volstetter's 1958 RAND report, The Delicate Balance of Terror. That was the original name of the script that Kubrick and Harris wanted to give the name of the film, was The Delicate Balance of Terror. Then there was John von Neumann, brilliant mathematician, polymath, and pioneering computer scientist, who was wheelchair-bound later in life, like Strangelove. He worked on the Manhattan Project as well as RAND. And then Edward Teller, who worked on the Manhattan Project. He is considered the scientist most prominent in the public eye and who remains most closely associated with Strangelove. Teller specialized in atomic physics and worked on his first atomic pile to create a sustainable nuclear chain reaction. Sellers' characterization of an ex-Nazi can be seen in scientist Werner von Braun. And this is what we were talking about like Operation Paperclip. This is what I did not know. So von Braun, he was a major in the SS, in the Nazi Party, and developed ballistic missiles using up to 60,000 concentration camp prisoners as slave labor. He oversaw scientists and engineers perfecting terror or vengeance weapons such as the V-1 pilotless pulse jet bomb and the camp at Buchenwald. Do you know how to pronounce that?
Buchenwald.
Where he personally picked labor slaves to work and die at his rocket assembly factories. Over 25,000 of these 60,000 prisoners were killed between August of 43 and April of 55 by beatings, execution, starvation, and or sickness, all at the hands of von Braun. So then what happened in 45 when the Russians were marching, he was, let's see, where was his base? It was deep within like a gypsum mine in some sort of southern mountain range in Germany. When he found that the Russians were marching and were going to overtake them, he took, like, his team of scientists and engineers, escaped from the mountain, surrendered to the Americans so they would not have to be butchered by the Russians. Also, the Nazi Party had put out a kill order on von Braun once Hitler, was gone, and they realized that this whole thing was coming to an end. So von Braun went to the Americans, surrendered, and then he was repatriated as an American to work on missiles for them, which I don't know. I do have problems with that. Somebody that, killed that many people in pretty much a slave labor camp and tortured them. But anyway, I guess it deterred the Russians, didn't it? That he was working for us.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Yeah.
Well, and like so many, not just like the scientists and stuff, but like soldiers in general. There was a big thing with German soldiers. Like they much preferred to surrender to Americans versus the Russians. And a lot of it was because the war was different on the Eastern Front than it was on the Western Front, and very vicious. And the Russians hated the Nazis, hated them, and they'd just kill them. Like it was bad. And the Americans were like Geneva Convention,
right?
So it was a lot different. But Operation Paperclip is really where it shows where it's like, yeah, they also there's stuff that helped them, that helped American aims, even though, and not only a Nazi, but an SS officer, which is like the bad. Yeah. All Nazis are bad, but the SS are like, they're the ones who perpetrated the Holocaust. So, yeah, it's bad.
Well, and then there was also Hubertus Strughold, who was chief of aeronautical research for the, is it Luftwaffe?
I think Luftwaffe, yeah.
Yeah, and similarly repatriated by the American OSS under Operation Paperclip. Once repatriated, Strughold became the first professor appointed to the U.S. Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine and chief scientist of NASA's Aerospace Medical Division. He worked on the physiology of high-altitude flight, pressure effects in the vacuum of space. Strughold was a major scientist overseeing several human biosystems for the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space programs. So he was far up the ladder also once he was repatriated. However, it was revealed late in his career that Strughold had experimented on children and concentration camp prisoners during his time with the Luftwaffe. Under the Nazi decree, Action T4 epileptic children housed at the Brandenburg Euthanasia Center were made available for his experimentation in vacuum chambers. Later, Strughold was implicated in war crimes conducted at Dachau?
Dachau.
Yeah, Dachau. Including experiments on Jews and Gypsies, which involved freezing people to near death and rewarming them, measuring how quickly they might recover or not. Nearly 200 people were either tortured to death by freezing or subsequently murdered if they survived as part of these experiments. Because of these actions, Strughold's aeronautical and medical colleagues, including his research assistant, were found guilty of crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials. Once all of this was found out, he faced multiple inquiries, and his wartime conduct, Strughold's prestigious reputation dwindled, and his civil and scientific honors and commemorative building names were removed across America. So this fact of, Dr. Strangelove apparently in the film must have been some sort of a repatriated Nazi scientist. Even though he's repatriated, you see from the very beginning, because every time he starts talking about massive Holocaust and genocide, he smiles. He smiles through the entire film.
Yeah. And he calls the president Mein Führer, and he does the salute. Right.
Well, and even his last monologue, brilliant last monologue by Peter Sellers, because you can see he gets so excited about talking about cleansing of society, when he's talking about putting everybody down in a bunker, the people that are the most beautiful, the most sexually desirable. And while he's talking about this, he gets so excited that, finally his right arm breaks away from his body, because his right arm really has a mind of its own, which is actually a real type of syndrome. I can't remember.
Yeah. Alien hand syndrome?
Yes, alien hand syndrome. By that point, everybody's realized that, they're all going to die. He's completely lost. It doesn't matter that he's unpatriating his repatriation. And he gets so excited and his arm breaks away from his body. According to Mick Broderick, in reconstructing Strangelove, the name of Strangelove possibly comes from the 1946 film noir The Strangelove of Martha Ivers, which is, have you ever heard of that before?
Have not.
It comes, I can't remember what studio it came out of, but it is Barbara Stanwyck, Kirk Douglas, who became, a favorite of Kubrick later on, Van Heflin, who was a major star at MGM, and then Elizabeth Scott, who was a star in minor film noirs for a certain time. I saw it on TCM when I was really little, and the only thing I can remember about it much, it was the spoilers at the end of the movie, Barbara Stanwyck ends up shooting herself and Kirk Douglas. But Judith Anderson, who plays Big Mama in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and she's Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca, and she's Mamnit in the Ten Commandments. Pretty much the very beginning of the movie, she's Barbara Stanwyck's evil aunt, and Barbara Stanwyck, as a child, witnesses Judith Anderson beating a kitten to death with her cane. So that's what starts the entire movie out. And a little bit more on that is that Kubrick in 1946 was working as an apprentice photographer at Look magazine in NYC, and he had to work on an article. It was a full-page ad and then a positive article about the movie when it came out the summer of 46. So it's a long bunny trail to go off into. McBroderick, he wrote I thought it was a very insightful sentence about The Strangelove of Martha Ivers and how it might have influenced him in creating that character. But I can't find that sentence now, so we're going to keep going on. And the characterization of Strangelove also perhaps comes from Fritz Lang's Metropolis. There is an evil German scientist named Rotwang in it who has a blacked glove hand. And then there's also a Peter Lorre character called Dr. Gogol in 1933 horror film Mad Love that was directed by Carl Freund, who was cinematographer on I Love Lucy. Fun fact, Mad Love is pretty much about the hands of a serial killer are chopped off and retransplanted on the hands of a pianist, and then the pianist starts to have, the desire to murder people as well after the hands have been transplanted. But he plays an evil mad doctor. Peter Lorre was one of Peter Sellers' earliest and most cherished voices to impersonate, because Peter Sellers could impersonate so many different people. So Peter Sellers' involvement in the film kind of came late. Peter Sellers had been involved with Kubrick on Lolita, and Kubrick loved his ability to impersonate and improvise almost every scene in that movie. And at the time that Columbia picked up Dr. Strangelove, Kubrick really didn't exactly want Sellers to come back and be in Dr. Strangelove, but I'm not exactly sure why. There hasn't been any kind of reports that they had any big fight. They did have a big fight that resulted in Peter Sellers breaking his leg, but we'll get to that in just a second. Lolita was released in the summer of 62. Columbia picked up Strangelove in the fall of 62, and they insisted that Kubrick cast Sellers in the film because they thought that his comedic timing, his comedic verve was one of the reasons that made Lolita so successful, other than it was a sexually perverse movie and nobody that was not being seen in the movie theaters at that time. So everybody went and saw Lolita. But anyway, he cast Sellers, and he knew because Sellers played a character called Claire Quilty that was a very kind of dark and disgusting character, like everybody in Lolita is except Lolita. And then he also impersonated a psychologist called Dr. Zempf. And Dr. Zempf in Lolita is somewhat of a similar characterization to Strangelove. So Kubrick knew that Sellers had this great canon of characters that he could play. So he started considering the fact that Sellers could play President Merkin Muffley, Strangelove, and then RAF Commander Group Captain Lionel Mandrake. And then he also was having him play Major Kong originally, which is the role Slim Pickens finally came into play. The reason that, Peter Sellers, when he first started to approach Major Kong, he could not do a Texan accent. Terry Southern, who was like script doctor for Strangelove that we've talked about, could do a Texan accent fantastically well. So Terry Southern recorded all of Major Kong's lines in a Texas accent. And then Peter Sellers walked around the set constantly with these massive headphones on, listening to his lines in the Texas dialect. So he finally got it. But the B-52 set, the B-52 that Ken Adams, production designer, belt was suspended 15 feet above the air. And when they were originally shooting Peter Sellers as Major Kong, Peter Sellers and Kubrick got in a big fight for some reason. And Peter Sellers, when he was trying to get out, wasn't watching where he was going. He fell 15 feet out of the airplane. He broke his leg. So then there was no way for him to be able to climb back up into the plane. So then that's when Slim Pickens was hired. And when he came into London, he came in with his Stetson hat and his cowboy boots. And Terry Southern said, well, how was your hotel? And he said, well, it's like my friend from Oklahoma said, give me some loose fitting shoes, a tight pussy, and a warm place to shit, and I'll be happy. So,
oh my God.
I mean,
oh my gosh.
It's not true for everybody. It was true for Slim Pickens. Kubrick said of Peter Sellers was the only actor I knew who could really improvise. Improvisation is something useful in rehearsal to explore a role. But most actors, when they improvise, stray into a sort of repetitive hodgepodge, which leads them down a dead end. While Sellers, by contrast, even when he wasn't on form, after a time fell into the spirit of the character and just took off. It was miraculous. Sellers completely improvised both phone calls to the Russian premiere. So what Kubrick would do is he would like set up 3 to 5 cameras around Sellers and just let him go. And they would do like 10-minute takes. And he could only do 2 or 3 before it was like Peter Sellers would lose steam and then he wouldn't be able to improvise as well as he would do. So he just had all of these different takes from all of these different cameras of Peter Sellers improvising pretty much every single line he said.
Wow.
And originally when Peter Sellers came in to play President Merkin Muffley, he wanted to play the president, which is really kind of genius because if you think about it, Peter Sellers, his character arc of all 4 characters, he's completely in control. He is the one that's trying to deter or to keep nuclear war from happening, but at the same time as Major Kong, he would be the one that was causing it. So that's kind of a genius thing that had to be cut out of the film. But as Merkin Muffley, he came in, originally, I think Kubrick had written in the script that he was supposed to be sick with a cold, and they got him out of his sick bed in the middle of the night. And so he was constantly working with an inhaler, improvising with an inhaler, with tissues, all sorts of stuff. And the first problem with that was nobody on the set could stop laughing at any of the takes. Everybody was just laughing hysterically at this over-the-top cold that he was performing. And then Stanley Kubrick eventually said, okay, so Merkin Muffley has to seem like the only sane and down-to-earth person that is trying to dissolve this issue that's popped up. So he said, let's take it back to, just regular human being, president of the United States. And Peter Sellers had a little bit of trouble like that until Kubrick said, well, why don't you play him, like Adlai Stevenson? And Kubrick was like, I can do that. Stevenson had run for presidency both in 52 and 56. So like you said, he was in the United Nations?
He was the ambassador to the UN.
Okay. Great. So he knew who he was. So that's another real true to life character that he was based on. Okay, so when Sellers was playing, Sellers recalled the experience of how Strangelove got his black glove. So Stanley Kubrick had the production designer, which we'll talk about the sets in just a second, Ken Adams, designed the war room. The ceiling was concrete, so they couldn't have any other lighting except for the lamps in the room. He was very insistent that they had just like those practical lights, not any other lights. They were incredibly hot. Stanley Kubrick had to go around adjusting them, and he had these black gloves that he was constantly wearing, and Peter Sellers was always thought the black gloves were very menacing. So what happened was Sellers said, one day Stanley suggested that I should wear a black glove, which would look rather sinister on a man in a wheelchair. Maybe he had an injury in a nuclear experiment of some sort, Kubrick said. So I put on the black glove and look at the arm, and I suddenly thought, hey, that's a stormtrooper's arm. So instead of leaving it there looking malignant, I gave the arm a life of its own. The arm hated the rest of the body for having made a compromise. That arm was a Nazi. So I thought that it wasn't even written in the script. That was Peter Sellers' idea to have this completely rogue arm. I was just watching the documentary. I think the script girl said that they had to do so many, he had camera angles all around Peter Sellers, but they had to keep cutting between cameras because everybody around him was laughing so hard. In the original script, Kubrick called General Turgidson General Schmuck, a rough, tough, folksy Air Force chief who keeps in tough physical shape and is proud of it. Kubrick needed to increase the character of Turgidson to grandiose size, so he encouraged George C. Scott to play the character with broad strokes and make his character larger than life. Kubrick had seen Scott in a local production in LA of The Merchant of Venice, and he knew immediately, this is the person that I want to play General Turgidson. However, Scott had a very volatile personality. He was constantly in barroom brawls. He was known as difficult to work on set. So what Kubrick did, he knew that George C. Scott loved chess. So he fancied himself a very, very good chess player. So he set up a chessboard on set and was constantly playing with Scott. And Scott would just sit for hours planning his next move, his next several moves. And so that's how Kubrick kept George C. Scott reined in. And then eventually Kubrick started winning all of the games against George C. Scott. And that's how he got his respect. So eventually when they got into more of the heavy filming, Kubrick took away the chessboard, but because Scott respected him, because Scott thought that he was the best chess player, but Kubrick showed him that he was not. That's how he reined in his volatile personality. And Kubrick wanted Scott to play the character way over the top, which you can see. It is like he is this very pumped up, very almost
fry the chickens by just flying over.
I know. Have you ever seen a B-52 just barrel it? And it's like, that's not the question. The question is, are we about to all die? He got so caught up in this over-the-top performance that, the trip that he does, like the acrobatic roll and then points up at the board, that was and then Scott just kept going. That was all a mistake. He was not supposed to do that, but Kubrick left it in. According to James Earl Jones, who played Lieutenant Zog, when he would watch Kubrick and Scott filming, Kubrick would be like, okay, let's just do a take, very serious, very down-to-earth general, do that one take. Then he'd do another take where he's like, pump it up a little bit. And then the third take would always be way over the top because Scott did not want to play the character over the top. He thought it was ridiculous. And then in the final film, Kubrick only used the takes of Scott way over the top. So when the shooting was over, Scott was convinced that he had given a terrible performance since Kubrick had coaxed him into hyperbolic acting. But Kubrick wrote to Scott shortly after the film previewed, I hope you will at least be somewhat assuaged, knowing that if in fact this is the worst performance you have ever given, everyone will think it's the best performance. The opinion of approximately 1,000 people who have seen the film is that your performance is one of the most brilliant, penetrating, and hilarious they've ever seen. This includes directors, producers, actors, writers, critics, publishers, etc., etc. I think it's a great performance. I think it's perfect for what the film is.
Well, and it's fun to watch too, because it's like, I only know George C. Scott from Patton, right?
Right.
And this, and like watching him devolve into a manic just outburst essentially is really fun, and it goes against type, and it really just adds a lot to the comedy. Like, I didn't expect, out of everyone in that movie, if I looked at the cast list, the person with the most physical comedic bit, I wouldn't expect it to be George C. Scott, but it is in a lot of those scenes.
Right.
And he chews gum like a chain smoker smokes cigarettes. I noticed that.
That's what I was going to say. I was like, yeah, that is his nervous tick. He sits there and pouts every time the president talks to him, like a big baby, but he also just chews gum and gum and gum. And I guess that he's trying to diffuse his, like I said, his kind of sexual aggression towards Mrs. Scott, because he interrupts the entire meeting to have a phone conversation with his mistress to, just be like, hang tight. I'll be right there. Just while we're talking about George C. Scott and the Merchant of Venice, the production he was in, I believe in LA, James Earl Jones was playing the Prince of Morocco. And Kubrick saw him in that, and he thought he was incredibly strong. And he was like, how would you like to make your film premiere? And that's how James Earl Jones got into filmmaking, was because of Stanley Kubrick. So there we go.
It's so fun to see him.
I know.
You're just like, there he is.
Well, there he is. And the first several times I watched the movie, I didn't even realize that was him until I watched the documentary, and I was like, oh, because he's so young. He doesn't even look, like James Earl Jones. We're used to seeing him as much older man. Slim Pickens does get the ultimate orgasm, as Herman Kahn referred to it, and rode the nuclear missile to the total annihilation of the world. Bronco busting his bomb. And I said this, Herman Kahn once joked that people don't have war plans, but they have wargasms. And Slim Pickens had the ultimate wargasm to end all wargasms. And this wargasm was an 11th hour inspiration by Kubrick. The idea of, I don't know if he didn't have in the script at the time, that you would actually see a bomb dropped on a Soviet base, but close to the end of shooting, Stanley Kubrick had this idea. Slim Pickens, Major Kong, was supposed to be in the bomb bay, looking at the bombs and seeing why the doors wouldn't open. And in the original script, they did not have the doors open or anything like that. I'm not exactly sure what was supposed to happen. But Stanley Kubrick had, like I said, an 11th hour inspiration, went to Ken Adams, and he was like, okay, so can we install some bomb doors, get them to open, and then we see the bomb drop? And he said, we need to do this within 48 hours. And Ken Adams was like, absolutely not. It would take several weeks to get those bomb doors on there and operational. So then Ken Adams went to the special effects supervisor, Wally Beavers, and Wally Beavers took a picture, black and white picture of the bomb bay. And I believe what they did is they superimposed Slim Pickens on there. And then he was able to animate on the film that the doors were opening. So that's an animation. And then you see the background projection. And then what they did is they took the missile that they had already built that was in the bomb bay, and they took a giant crane and they filmed Slim Pickens riding, on the bomb, but he was in front of a blue background. So then what they did is they cut that out, superimposed it onto the back of another background projection, and then they made him look smaller and smaller and smaller. So that was just something that was done at the very last second, which I thought was amazing, because that is the perfect end to the
probably the most iconic shot of the film too.
Exactly.
It's what I think of.
Right. He's riding a giant phallus down, and it's the perfect end to the beginning. The first time I saw the movie, the Try a Little Tenderness theme song, the very romantic theme song that the movie starts with, I thought that was just that's just another funny paradox to what's really going on, because you're seeing a B-52 being refueled by KC-135 Stratotanker. So this is what Mick Broderick wrote about it. The initiation of this wargasm at the end of the movie seems to be the opening, as the first image of the film proper is of a metallic antenna jutting from the nose of a jet, with a narrow slit as its rounded tip, a penile eye at the head of a monstrous phallus thrust forward to the instrumental strains of Try a Little Tenderness. The turbulent clouds of the Columbia logo segue to a montage of overlapping stock footage high above the cloud tops, showing B-52s refueling midair. It is a sexual ballet mécanique, with the shaft from a KC-135 Stratotanker penetrating the strategic bomber before it breaks away. Seemingly spent from the deposit of its aviation essence, its retracted aerodynamic boom and recipient B-52 swing listlessly while the accompanying tune fades to silence. So yes, what we do is, we've just watched softcore porn, apparently.
Pretty much.
Yeah, well, and so Pablo Ferro, who created this, he created the opening titles because Kubrick could not come up with an idea of how to start the film off, and he needed some sort of opening sequence so that they could display the titles. So Kubrick went to Pablo Ferro, who worked at Columbia, who did opening titles for a lot of films, and he said, well, what is your opinion of human beings in general? And Pablo Ferro said, well, everything that human beings invent is incredibly sexual. And so then they were like, why don't we show a B-52 being refueled? And so Pablo Ferro created this whole opening sequence, and the titles were handwritten by him. And so he showed it to Stanley Kubrick, and Kubrick was like, this is great. And Pablo Ferro said, well, I'll put it, more in typed out type. And Stanley Kubrick was like, no, I actually like your handwriting. I think that's perfect for the film. So I feel like that is a font that I've seen a lot of times since then.
Yeah, for sure.
And it was all because Stanley Kubrick liked his handwritten font.
That's so interesting, because that type of font, I know exactly where I've seen it in other places.
Right.
And it's just some dude writing.
Right, it is. It's somebody Right, and it comes straight out of black comedy. And then another kind of interesting thing, Laurie Johnson wrote the music with tension mounting through Johnny Comes Marching Home, which I think is absolutely brilliant that they keep playing that, because that's part of Major Kong's whole purpose in the film, is that, Americans don't stop no matter what. You keep pushing through to the end. And that's what causes the end of the movie, is his, constant persistence. So a little bit about Sterling Hayden, who played Jack D. Ripper. He had worked on Kubrick's 1956 film The Killing, and he hadn't made a picture since 58. So pretty much he had just exiled himself to France because he was in so much debt to the IRS in back taxes. And he had this massive estate, I believe, in California. And he he exiled himself to France to a houseboat, I think, while the IRS just took out giant chunks of his estate to pay off his back taxes. So he had not been back. The movie was shot at Shepperton Studios, which we can talk about in just a second, but he had not made a movie since 58. So the entire first day, he was incredibly nervous. He kept flubbing lines and stuff like that. And it was Kubrick and Peter Sellers that eventually kind of, massaged him back into that. But he was absolutely perfect as, and it's a bunch of the warmongering that we still see today, even on television, or the fear mongering, So Tracy Reed was, who played Mrs. Scott, was the daughter of famed film director Sir Carol Reed. She had to wear a bikini. Now, this is the thing I'm not too fond about, is Kubrick. She went into interview with Kubrick, and he said, well, I'm kind of embarrassed. He said, you have to wear a bikini because she's supposed to be this general's mistress. And, she's also you see it in Major Kong's magazine that she's like a Playboy model. And so he was like, I need to inspect your body to make sure it's okay. And so he said, well, it's not bad. So I guess you got the part. Anyway. So Kubrick wanted the set design to be based on reality. So Ken Adams was a German Jew from Berlin who was also an RAF pilot during World War II. He had designed bomb shelters, actually. Ken Adams had also designed all of the sets for Dr. No, with James Bond. And that was very sleek, very kind of space age. And that's exactly what Kubrick wanted. But he also wanted it to look like, something real. So I believe it was 130 feet long, 100 feet wide, and 35 feet high, with a table that was 22 feet in diameter. And Kubrick had Ken Adams cover it in green base, like the top of a poker table. And Ken Adams was like, but it's shot in black and white. It doesn't make any difference. And Kubrick said, well, it makes difference to the actors because it needs to feel like they're playing poker with the fate of the world. Over 10 miles of electrical cable were required to light the big board, which kept track of U.S. nuclear bombs. The floors were made of black formica. So anybody that was, unless they were doing like master shots where men had to be in shoes, they all had to wear slippers because the floors would scuff so easily. So after initial previews of the film, the Pentagon demanded that a disclaimer be instated at the beginning of the movie, which states, it is the stated position of the United States Air Force that their safeguards would prevent the occurrence of such events as are depicted in this film. Furthermore, it should be noted that none of the characters portrayed in this film are meant to represent any real persons living or dead. And then I wrote, however, in all caps, after the announcement of the success of Sputnik in 57, Strategic Air Command initiated an operational alert system where 1/3 to a half of its nuclear bombers were on standby and ready for a 15-minute takeoff, concerned about vulnerability on the ground to Soviet ICBMs, which are ballistic missiles. The United States Air Force maintained up to 12 nuclear-armed bombers airborne 24 hours a day under various code names such as Head Start, Round Robin, and Chrome Dome. So that's the very first thing that, points to the fact that Dr. Strangelove could have actually happened. I know,
that is so terrifying.
Well, and it's like, okay, so you basically given bombs to whoever, and they're just flying them around the world nonstop. Maybe one will drop them. Who knows? Or what if one of them crashes? I read in this book, I can't remember much about this specific incident, but a B-52, they were doing a test flight, I think in around 54, a test flight in the Midwest with one of these B-52s. And this that was carrying like a 30 megaton atomic bomb. The B-52 broke apart in mid-flight and crashed. And because of some sort, there was just like some little thing that caused the bomb not to detonate. So if it had detonated, it would have wiped out the entire Midwest. But this is the next thing. But it is quite likely that Plan R in the film the plan that enables lower echelon military commanders to use nuclear bombs in the events that the president and his staff are taken out is what prompted the U.S. Air Force to require Columbia Pictures to insert the disclaimer at the head of the film. As National Security Archive NSA has shown, a previously top secret directive initiated by President Eisenhower and undertaken by successive presidents throughout the 1960s confirms that the principal plot device of Red Alert and Dr. Strangelove was entirely plausible. As early as March 1956, President Eisenhower, previously America's commander-in-chief in Europe during World War II, sought Defense and State Department policy advice on establishing advanced presidential authorization for nuclear weapons use by senior commanders. Later that year, Eisenhower approved advanced authorization for air defense forces to employ nuclear weapons against any attack on the continental USA. And by May 1957, Eisenhower had guidelines drafted for a pre-release authority of nuclear weapons expenditure in at least two situations. One, when attacks by sea or by air on U.S. territory and positions providing no time for consultation with the president on defensive measures, or two, when enemy attacks prevented a presidential decision and it was necessary to protect U.S. forces abroad, including those in international waters, or to launch strategic air command to retaliate to nuclear attack on the continental U.S. Okay, well, this just goes on for a long time, but pretty much it was the exact same thing that happened in the film was legal in the United States. So lower echelon commanders could be in charge of nuclear bombs. So if somebody was absolutely crazy, they could have set off a nuclear bomb. And I think it was McGeorge Bundy. When Kennedy got into the White House, he was one of his primary advisors, and he said, listen, this idea is just stupid. Somebody's going to set off an atomic bomb and kill everybody. And Kennedy just ignored him. So there were people in the government that knew that this was a thing and that they were like, absolutely not, this should not be in place. But Kennedy just ignores him. And of course, Eisenhower, I feel like a lot of the generals out of World War II and the Cold War and stuff were just crazy, as we will soon talk about. Okay, so Kubrick kept in his Strangelove files a press clipping for the 2nd of April 1962 edition of Newsweek. It reported that experts were worried that any one of the thousands of personnel responsible for atomic munitions could go berserk and start a private nuclear war. The article noted that in order to prevent such an occurrence, Strategic Air Command General Curtis E. LeMay ordered that all 50,000 airmen with any possible access to nuclear weapons be rescreened for a human reliability certificate. So what that meant is like upper echelon commanders were then screening lower echelon commanders on the fact that, are these people psychotics or not, as they referred to them at the time. So a RAND report that was run on, what is this human reliability certificate, discovered that Air Force staff working with nuclear weapons required a top secret clearance, but no psychological screening. And individuals with transient psychotic disorders were permitted to join the United States Air Force. And up to 20 airmen per year employed on nuclear weapons details were expected to have a severe mental breakdown. These researchers, through RAND, detailed a range of chilling case histories involving Air Force officers, pilots who were paranoiacs, and schizophrenics who suffered regular anxiety attacks, hostile sexual fantasies, and delusions of grandeur. Some presented with paranoid delusions and believed they were invested with a special mission that set them apart from society, like our General Jack D. Ripper. So in actuality, yeah, it's like you said in the beginning, every single thing that could have gone wrong in the past that hasn't goes wrong in Dr. Strangelove. Beginning with a crazed general. General Turgidson, General Ripper were based on Curtis E. LeMay, who was the head of Strategic Air Command, I think, until the early 60s, and then Thomas Powers took over. Throughout the Cold War, General LeMay deliberately sought to provoke an international incident that would provide a pretext for him to deliver his Sunday Punch, a massive preemptive air attack, delivering hundreds of atomic and hydrogen bombs that would cause tens of millions of Soviet fatalities. One example of such provocation occurred in 1954 when LeMay ordered nuclear-armed bombers to fly across Russia and commented to his aides, well, maybe if we do this overflight right, we can get World War III started. So then you have LeMay in office, and then Powers took over. Thomas Powers. And according to Powers' own Deputy General Loris Norstad, I used to worry about General Power. I used to worry that General Power was not stable. I used to worry about the fact that he had control over so many weapons and weapon systems and could, under certain conditions, launch the Force. Back in the days before we had real positive control, Sack had the power to do a lot of things, and it was in his hands, and he knew it. Power infamously fumed to a nuclear strategist who had the temerity to counsel restraint during a 1968 Strategic Air Command briefing. Restraint? Why are you concerned with saving their lives? The whole idea is to kill the bastards. Look, at the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian, we win. And then the strategist replied, well, you better make sure that they're a man and a woman. I read that Khrushchev used as propaganda a lot the fact that our war generals were absolute madmen. And, reading that without the knowledge of Powers and LeMay, you're like, oh, right, you're just trying to vilify us. And it's like, no, actually, we're probably...
they are crazy.
Right, they are crazy. They're fueled with power. When making the film, Ken Adams and his production designer, I can't remember his name, they lacked cooperation from the Pentagon in the making of the film because they kept asking, what do B-52s look like, the inside of B-52s? And the Pentagon would not share that information with them. B-52s were relatively new and very classified. They didn't want that information getting out. So the Ken Adams production designer found a book called Strategic Air Command, and the very front had just a single picture of the cockpit of a B-52. So they went off of that, and they went off of some declassified information, and they created the entire plane. And when the film went to press, they invited some members of the Air Force and Strategic Air Command to come look at the set of the B-52. And Ken Adams said all of their faces went white because they were like, this is exactly right. And Stanley Kubrick heard about it, and he wrote to Ken Adams and he said, I hope you got all of this information about the B-52s legally. And Ken Adams said, well, maybe we did, maybe we didn't. Who knows?
Oh my gosh.
This is kind of interesting. So when the very beginning of the film and when the B-52 is flying through like Russia, a second unit was dispatched to the Arctic Circle to film the background projections for 3 weeks. And as they were traveling from Greenland to Iceland, the second unit flew across a secret American airbase that forced them to land in the ice fjord. Because Dr. Strangelove was written on the side of the plane, the airbase thought that they were Russian spies. So all of that, which I believe I listened to a podcast with Mick Broderick, and he said this filming that he did in Iceland and Greenland in the Arctic Circle had never been done before. There were no background projections that looked like that. So that was also rather ahead of its time. And okay, so this is one thing that I had never heard that I thought was very interesting. It was originally planned for the film to end with a scene that depicted everyone in the war room involved in a pie fight that took 2 weeks to... Have you heard about the pie fight?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
I mean, Stanley Kubrick said that he cut... Well, first off, everybody on set said that he cut the pie fight because it's, they're on the brink of nuclear disaster. So everybody goes absolutely crazy. And while they were doing it, there was so much whipped cream flying everywhere that you could barely see everybody. And all of the actors were laughing hysterically, which he did not felt fit into the theme of the plane. He said, I decided it was farce and not consistent with the satiric tone of the rest of the film. The pie fight was farce. Critic Alexander Walker observed that the cream pies were flying around so thickly that people lost definition and you couldn't really see whom you were looking at. Niall Southern, son of screenwriter Tony Southern, suggested that the fight was intended to be less jovial. Since they were laughing, it was unusable because instead of having that totally black, which would have been amazing, like this blizzard, which in a sense is metaphorical for all of the missiles that are coming as well, you just have these guys having a good old time. So as Kubrick later stated, it was a disaster of Homeric proportions. There was another line that was in the pie fight that wasn't going to work with what happened actually in real life, which we'll get to in just a second. After they shot the entire film at Shepperton Studios, real fast, they shot the film at Shepperton Studios because Kubrick found, I believe in 1961, when he was shooting Lolita, he had shot a lot in LA and New York, and it was incredibly expensive to shoot in both places. He found out that if he used 80% of the people he employed to create his film, whether they were actors or crew, whatever, if he employed 80% Englishmen, then he could write off the majority of the expenses if he shot in London. So he shot at Shepperton Studios, which was outside of London. So after they were finished shooting, editor Tony Harvey put the film together according to the script from beginning to end, and they said it did not work whatsoever. It was terrible. They screened it for some Columbia executives. They were like, well, we can't release this. So then what Kubrick and Tony Harvey did is they took the entire film apart. They put each take, each scene on note cards, and they put it on a board, and they rearranged the whole thing, which is one reason why this finalized script, or the finalized script that they used to shoot from, was never published, was because the script is a totally different film than Dr. Strangelove. Stanley Kubrick had to create that film in the editing room with the shots that he had. And then a first test screening was scheduled for November 22nd, 1963. And that was the day that JFK was assassinated. So they put off the screening. Also, there's a line that Slim Pickens has in the film that he was like, he's saying the stuff that, like, in their boxes, like if they drop the nuclear bomb, he's like listing stuff out like condoms, different kinds of pills, different kinds of food. So if they drop the bomb and then they have to find some place to land their plane, they have these boxes to keep them safe and keep them alive for some time until they can find civilization. And Slim Pickens mentions all of this stuff, and he was like, heck, you can have a good time in Dallas with all this stuff. So that line had to be relooped. Heck, you can have a good time in Vegas with all of this stuff. And then in the pie fight, General Turgidson says, gentlemen, our gallant young president has been struck down in his prime. And they didn't want, that was another thing that they couldn't have used.
Yeah, bad timing on that one.
Terrible timing. Stanley Kubrick was in charge. He wanted to be in charge of advertisement. So he had someone, I think Pablo Ferro, possibly, who created the titles, create like the cartoon that you see from 1964. Cartoon advertisement, like for the print sheets that they would put in movie theaters. Columbia thought that was too avant-garde, excuse me. So then they used that print, but then the cartoon, but then they put production stills of the movie all around it. And that was considered kind of forward thinking, like he changed the face of advertising with that one cartoon. And then everybody involved in the film, except Slim Pickens, were camera shy when it came to interviews about the movie. So only Slim Pickens would go out and give interviews about the movie, and sometimes Peter Sellers. And then Pablo Ferro also created all of the advertisements that you saw in movie theaters, which were also considered kind of cutting edge and forward for most movie making. So those were several things that it had in its well, and also Kubrick was terrified that Columbia wasn't going to know, because they were somewhat a major studio, wasn't going to know how to market the film. He thought it was just going to be some like wacky send-off that nobody would come and see. And that was definitely not the case. With Pablo Ferro's advertisements, a lot of people came to see it. And it cost almost $2 million to make, and it made double its production budget and then some. And then eventually it made, I think, $9 million. But originally, Bosley Crowther, who had written for the New York Times for many, many years, tore the film apart, as he tore many films apart in the 1960s, such as Bonnie and Clyde, Midnight Cowboy, all of the films that pushed the boundaries of like modernism filmmaking. And then like 2 months later, he came back and he apologized, and he said, I watched it again, and this is actually a brilliant film that you should all go see. So it was kind of amazing the impact that it had, even on someone like Bosley Crowther. Yeah, it was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. For Best Screenplay, Best Director, Best Actor, and Best Picture. It did not win any, but Kubrick picked up Best Director from the New York Film Critics. However, Robert Brustein wrote the best review of Dr. Strangelove according to Kubrick. Brustein said, responding to critics who saw it as just a gag and irresponsible way to treat the end of the world, Brustein said that Kubrick has managed to explode the right-wing position without making a single left-wing affirmation. The Order of the 30s, which clung to even the best work of Chaplin, Wells, and Huston, has finally been disinfected here. Disinfected, in fact, is the stink of all ideological thinking. Its only politics is outrage against the malevolence of officialdom. Humanitarians will find it inhuman, but they're wrong. Dr. Strangelove releases through comic poetry those feelings of impotence and frustration that are consuming us all, and I can't think of anything more important for an imaginative work to do. And that, my dear listeners, is the making of Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. 3 hours in, I think. So, Garrett, do you have any other thoughts on like the making of this, or thoughts that you came up with over Strangelove in general?
It is so interesting how eerily similar it is to what actually happened, and
Mhm.
them not knowing that at the time. That strikes me. And just how self-aware it is. Like, one of the things I noted when I watched it is all of the in the background, there's these signs for the bomber group that says peace is our profession.
Right.
And like, just it's so self-aware of like what how just insane this whole thing is. And when you extrapolate it out to its furthest extent, like, it's actually dangerous. And we live in a world where that's still very, very present today.
Well, and it's almost like our world forgot about it after the Iron Curtain
Yeah.
fell, or like the Berlin Wall fell, and then just since Ukraine has started back up, well, yeah, it's come back into the zeitgeist, into our
Yeah.
fourth thought. But even like on September 11th, it wasn't. They didn't just forget about it. I read several newspaper articles. People were terrified after the towers went down that there was going to be like a nuclear bomb in the suitcase that was going to take out Manhattan.
hmm Yeah. Well, and we have other things like I do think it's a movie that is definitely a product of the anxiety of the time.
Mhm.
And like, a modern day equivalent, I think, is like Don't Look Up, right? Like,
Mhm.
that movie is about climate change and like how ridiculous it is that we don't look at these things.
Right.
And it's honestly a little discouraging because you look at it and you're like, Stanley Kubrick made this thing and it really didn't change anything. Like,
Mhm.
everything kind of played itself out, but it's not like that. It's not like anything changed. It just kind of, we got really lucky, and
Yeah.
it's one of those things that it's kind of, I mean, it's sad, and it makes it difficult to be hopeful for the
Right.
future when
Well,
you,
when you think about all the people in charge and really if they're actually acting like that, because the military and political leaders in the film are based on real people, it's like, what actual hope do we have?
yeah.
Um, but I mean, and there were many films in the 60s that came out with that same theme.
Yeah. Well,
So
and I think the premise at the end of like, we'll live in a mine shaft and all the rich and powerful people. I'm like, we hear those same things when we talk about climate change and rich people wanting to go to Mars. And I know that we like laugh it off that it's like, oh, it's a joke or it's whatever. But like,
right.
there are futurists and people who are visionaries or whatever that like do think that we can laugh at Elon Musk, but like, that is, if this becomes a reality, it's not for everyone. Like,
No.
it's not meant to save everyone, and that's how these people view these things, or at least the practical manifestation of what could happen. And I mean, it can be really discouraging.
It really can.
Like, it can be. I understand why Stanley Kubrick was preoccupied with that early on in his
Yes.
career.
Oh yeah, for sure. And real fast, talking about one thing I forgot to talk about, other films that came out in the 60s. There was one film that came out at the end of 64 called Fail Safe. Have you heard of Fail Safe? With Henry
Mhm.
Fonda, Walter Matthau, several other big people were in it. It was directed by Sidney Lumet, who directed Network and Murder on the Orient Express, some films in the big films in the 70s and 80s. But the writers of that, last names Wheeler and Burdick, had written a piece for Newsweek. I think it was a serialization called Failsafe, and they had put that out in Newsweek, and then they published it as a book. And Stanley Kubrick read it, brought it to Peter George's attention, and was like, "This is." And this was like in '61 after Red Alert had come out. He said, "This is." Eerily similar to what you wrote, and Wheeler and
Mhm.
Burdick were like, "Oh no, this is it. This is actually based on a book. I think it was called Abraham 59 that Wheeler had written in 1959. He was like before the publication of Red Alert even came to the United States. But
Mhm.
anyway, what happened with that is it came out at the end of 64, but Columbia picked up that picture also. And Kubrick sued Burdick and Wheeler. And originally they were with some smaller production company, and the lawsuit collapsed that production company. And Peter George got like $7,500 out of the whole thing. But yeah, it's very, and because that is like a very serious dramatic thriller, that Columbia put both of those out. Anyway, it's just something
Yeah.
I forgot to talk about.
Well, I mean, you talk about the anxieties of the time, and like, there's been studies and papers written about how like our fascination today with like disaster movies and even superhero movies, right? Like the Avengers are, you could classify them to some degree as disaster movies because
Mhm.
there's this big impending doom
Yeah.
and people have to team together and fix it. Well, you extrapolate that like in the current day, and that if you were to apply that to an anxiety we feel, you could talk about climate change versus in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, the movies kind of revolved around the collapse of systems and like because we were all feeling the aftershocks of 9/11 and those anxieties and and just how movies can really tell you so much about what that the society and books like any media but movies in particular can tell you so much about what anxieties the people are living with every day
Mhm.
because it comes out in the wash like how people are feeling about the world they live in and how fragile it all seems or secure it all seems too because
Mhm.
that comes as well. There's times
Right.
where we feel secure and our media reflects that. The 80s, right? Like there's very the 80s films are very pro-American, very can be very pro-American and very just very comfortable in
Right.
where it is, because the Cold War's winding down. It's evident we're going to win, and the nuclear threat's there, but it's not the forefront of everyone's
Mhm.
mind. Yeah,
Well,
it's a really fascinating film to look at.
it is. And one more fast thing, I think it was Herman Kahn that said the only way to ultimate control and safety is through total nuclear annihilation, which makes perfect sense. But it reminds me that I forgot to talk about the real life doomsday machines that we had. Did you know we had doomsday machines?
I've heard of them. Yeah, I
Okay.
kind of.
Okay, as early as 54, William L. Lawrence was reporting in the New York Times that U.S. experiments in the Pacific had made the previously theoretical concept of a doomsday cobalt bomb possible. Lawrence quoted Albert Einstein from 50, who said of a cobalt hydrogen bomb, if successful, radioactive poisoning of the atmosphere and hence annihilation of any life on Earth will have been brought within the range of technical possibilities. The U.S.'s approach to total world annihilation was through complete nuclear radiation and fallout, which would have poisoned everybody. The Soviets, however, they conceptualized in 64 and finally built in the 1980s one that was called Perimeter. And it was like if the Soviet Union had been struck by a nuclear weapon and there was only a select number of military and political leaders left, wherever they were in a bunker, in their certain bunkers, they could set off nuclear missiles that would totally annihilate the entire world. And also, I'm not sure when they came up with it. It might have been 64 also. Uh, they had one called the Dead Hand, which they abandoned after they conceptualized and partially developed it. They contemplated an automatic doomsday device, which triggering sensors were to launch the command missiles when excited by the light or seismic shock or radiation or atmospheric density resulting from an incoming nuclear strike. When former military leader General Colonel Andron Danilovich declared that the military had explored the possible system development, but they evaluated the posture as too dangerous and unreliable and halted their development. So thank goodness for that. Because Dead Hand is precisely the kind of device that is in Strangelove that sets off the amazing ending with Vera Lynn singing We'll Meet Again as the entire world is destroyed.
Just destroyed. Yeah.
And Peter Sellers, right when he realized at the climax of his character, Mein Führer, I can walk, is when the entire world explodes. So anyway.
Yeah. What a line to end on.
Yeah. I mean, I just think I say this about all the films we talk about because I think they're all great. But I mean, it is a genius film, and it's a genius for the time, especially one that pushed filmmaking forward into the future, and kind of looking at things realistically instead of kind of what Kirk Douglas, now we're wrapping back around to Spartacus, what he wanted to do with Spartacus, which was the very good American hero, instead of like the very beleaguered slave who was not very happy at all.
Yeah. And it's such a great film, and it's a film that's like, you wish we couldn't relate to it. I wish I could just appreciate it as a great film.
Right.
I wish I didn't feel like we could relate to that existential threat.
But I feel like,
alas,
I know. I feel like so many of society's problems come from certain people not being able to relate to other people's problems. So yeah.
True.
So anyway, is there anything else you can think about that you could pull out of that brain?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I had fun talking with you today. Moving away from Dr. Strangelove, it was great. I hope everybody enjoyed listening to it today. But as always, go show some love to some boutique labels that are doing restorations on films and putting them on HBO Max or Netflix or Hulu. Go buy the Blu-rays if that's your thing. Be sure to cinematically scintillate and go watch a new classic film. Until next time, this is
Garrett McPherson
and Ben Burke. Thank you for listening to the Hollywood Babylonians. You have been listening to the Hollywood Babylonians. The Hollywood Babylonians is produced, hosted, and written by Ben Burke, with research by Ben Burke and Garrett McPherson. The Hollywood Babylonians is edited by Andrew Davis. Sources include Reconstructing Strangelove, Inside Stanley Kubrick's Nightmare Comedy by Mick Broderick, Stanley Kubrick, American Filmmaker by David Mickix, Inside Dr. Strangelove, a documentary, and Wikipedia. Artwork by Ben Burke and Jamie Lee. If you liked what you heard today, be sure to follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at The Hollywood Babylonians for more Hollywood Babylonians content. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Tune in next week as we explore another film from the golden age of Hollywood and the history behind it. Thank you for listening and have a good night.